Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out evil spirits and to heal every disease and sickness.
The Bible contains remarkable stories of miracles and divine interventions. Moses parted the sea. Peter healed a man lame from his mother's womb. Jesus drove demons out of people and raised others from the dead. But are these types of events still happening today?
We too have a beam of divine light and guidance that God has put within the heart of every man. And it's one of the greatest proofs that there is a God.
More amazing supernatural things are happening than we realize.
This is Divine Intervention, the interview show that features intriguing people who've experienced the hand of God in amazing ways. Divine Intervention was created and produced with the purpose of encouraging believers, spiritual seekers, and skeptics alike that Jesus is alive and is still performing miracles and working in the world today.
I believe in miracles.
Here's your host, Daniel Fazina.
Hello, friend, and welcome to Divine Intervention Radio. I am your host, Daniel Fazina. So excited to be with you today. Got a wonderful guest in store for you. We're going to be sharing a testimony of how God preserved the life of a man who, by all rights, should have been dead several times over. And he used his second, third, and, fourth chances at life to really dedicate himself to the Lord and to do the Lord's work. So it's going to be a very encouraging episode. Before we get to our special guest, though, I would like to remind you that if you miss any of the episodes of Divine Intervention Radio, you can check us out online. DivineInterventionRadio.com is the website to go to, DivineInterventionRadio.com. You can listen to the archives there and get all the updates about guests and happenings there. You can also pick up a copy of my book, Divine Intervention, 50 True Stories of God's Miracles Today. So if you need a pick-me-up or you're looking to give a gift to someone who needs maybe a faith boost, these 50 testimonies of true life miracle stories are really going to lift you up and boost your faith. There's things in there from answered prayers to miraculous healings, deliverances, conversion experiences, you name it. All to the glory of Jesus, demonstrating how he intervenes in everyday people's lives. So again, you can pick up the book, Divine Intervention, 50 True Stories of God's Miracles Today at DivineInterventionRadio.com. You can also listen on iTunes to the archives of the show, and you can connect with me, DivineIntervention@mail.com is the email address. DivineIntervention@mail.com. Drop me a line. Let me know that you're listening and what the show means to you. That would mean so much to me to know that you're out there listening and that the show is blessing you in some way. And you can also connect with me on Twitter, twitter.com, and the handle is Daniel Fazina1. That's Daniel Fazina, the numeral 1, on twitter.com. Well, friend, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever had the experience where you've had a very close call with death? Maybe it was a near miss, a car accident, something where you really could have been seriously injured or hurt, but somehow you escaped unscathed, or at least with your life and limbs intact. You know, the Bible is full of stories of God's servants who went through difficult circumstances, but they were protected and preserved because God had a plan and purpose for their life. It kind of reminds me of the Apostle Paul. If you remember his story, I mean, this guy went through a lot. He was shipwrecked, he was beaten, he was stoned, he was imprisoned, he was bitten by a venomous snake, did not die. God had preserved him for a very important calling. And today's guest is kind of an example of that. I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Earl Ingram Jr. to the show. Now, I met Earl when I was doing publicity work, and Earl had his own radio show out of Wisconsin. I was booking guests for him, and we kind of developed a good relationship. He's a very interesting man, and his background is basically has a lot to do with the auto industry. He worked in the auto industry for 34 years, and his divine intervention experiences all happen to revolve around cars, as you'll hear. But Earl's a very interesting guy, and he's got some really cool testimonies. And what God is doing with him right now is really commendable and honorable as well. He's working with disadvantaged youth in Milwaukee, Wisconsin area, and I really think his testimony is going to encourage you. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome my special guest, Earl Ingram, right now on Divine Intervention Radio. Earl, you are on Divine Intervention. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the honor. I'm honored that you would consider me to have an opportunity to speak with your great audience.
Well, you know what? I've been looking forward to this interview because you are a very interesting guy, and you've had some pretty cool divine intervention experiences, and we want to encourage our audience with those. Before we get to some of your amazing experiences, let's take it to the beginning a little bit. Tell us about your background growing up and maybe a little bit about your faith journey.
Well, I'm one of 13 children.
13? Wow.
I am actually number 7, right in the middle, meaning I was the forgotten child.
Oh, boy.
Six younger, 6 older, so, the one guy in the middle, he's the guy who gets left out.
You're like the Jan Brady, huh?
My mom and dad were married for 63 years until the evil consequences of time took my mom away a couple years ago. My dad is 87 years of age, and he's still going. And we are blessed to have him there. I have lost 2 siblings. I lost one of my younger brothers a couple years ago, and lost a brother at the age of 12 from tumor at the brain.
Oh, my goodness.
But we've been pretty blessed. I have been married to the same woman for over 35 years.
Praise God.
And we have 2 sons, 37 years old and 25 years old. I can't get it wrong, or I'll have to pay the price.
Right. Okay. And tell us about your faith background and how you came to know the Lord.
Well, I was raised in the church. As a very young man, my grandmother would often go to church, and I would go to church with her, and sometimes 4 to 5 days a week. And
wow,
never knew or thought much of it, but I always remember, and this was not a really huge church. It was kind of like a storefront church, but I learned an awful lot in that type of environment. Doesn't matter how big the church is; it's how much love and how much commitment is there from the person who runs it. And so the guy who was there, while the reverend that was there during the time I was a young man, love emitted from that church, and he was a very big man. Even though he was in a small church, I learned that you can take a little man and put him in a big church, and pretty soon you will have a little church. But you can take a big man from a small church, put him in a bigger church, and he'll make it even bigger. I learned so much about compassion, how important it is to be concerned about the fellow man, and I have taken that with me through my entire life. How important it is to understand that we are really all connected, interconnected. It doesn't matter what our backgrounds are. We're all a part of humanity. And somewhere along the way, it has stuck with me all this time that humanity is the most important thing. Everything else comes after that.
Interesting. I remember growing up in my church, too. We had a relatively small church, and the pastor, his name is Pastor Wagner, and he was just so humble and loving. I just remember him loving us so much. Such a gentle man. He really, in my opinion, reflected the love of Christ to us, and that always stuck with me. So I'm glad you had a good church experience as well. Now, you've had several, I guess you could call them close calls, where you really saw the hand of God intervening in your life, and several of them have to do with automobiles. Actually, there's 3 of them in your life. So tell us about the first one. It happened when you were about 16 years old?
Yes, sir. I was 16 years old. I had just gotten my permit here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and my older sister had just purchased a brand new red 1969 Mustang.
Nice car.
And oh yes, so that was around 1970. So here she let me drive it. She had confidence and faith in me, and I had three of my buddies in the car with me. And as 16-year-old boys will often do, I was behind the wheel of that car, and your young boys are wanting to show off for one another. And so I remember my vision is 20/80. It's always been pretty bad. And while I was behind the wheel of that car, I wanted to show the guys. I didn't know how much power was really behind a car. I had never driven one for the most part, especially one with that much power. And I never will forget there was a 1970 Dodge Charger.
Oof.
That pulled up right next to us.
The makings of a drag race right there.
I watched a lot of television.
Yeah.
I watched a lot of television, and so he started revving the engine, and he had a standard, and the car I was driving was automatic, and he started revving his engine. I put my sisters in neutral, I started revving hers, and when the light changed, it was like we were at the motor speedway, and I remember slamming down the accelerator, and I didn't have any control. I didn't know what I was doing, and of course the Charger just blew us away. And in the meantime, I struggled with control of the car and kind of moved over into the other lane, and only through God's grace did we not die right then and there. Many young people have done the exact same thing that I did, and lost their lives. So God was not ready.
So what happened? You're going into oncoming traffic?
Absolutely. And to head on, it should have been a head-on collision. And of course, I don't know, I might have been doing 55, 60. This is on a regular street. And God stayed it and was able to recover and just do the damage, to pretty extensive damage, but we did not do a head-on collision, and so there was nothing but God's intervention in the affairs that spared me and the young people we were with. But not only that, but imagine having to live with taking somebody else's life through your ignorance. So
absolutely,
I didn't have to deal with that. He spared my life and everybody else at that point in time.
So you veered into oncoming traffic, and you actually did hit another car?
Absolutely.
Okay, but it wasn't a head.
Absolutely. I hit them with the driver's side, front left side where the driver is. Did pretty extensive damage, but we were able to not have the head-on collision that we probably should have had at that point in time.
Okay. You remember what was going through your mind at that point when you saw an oncoming car?
Well, you're 16 years old.
Yeah.
And all you can think about is, this is my sister's new car.
Oh boy.
and I don't want to damage it. I had nothing else. I had no thought process or concept of what really could take place or transpire that could have impacted or affected the rest of my life. We had the head-on collision, certainly my life would be much different today.
Absolutely.
Had I survived and had others not survived than it is today.
Right. Wow, okay. Well, I'm glad you survived that, and you've had a couple of other instances, and one was with when you had to change a tire, and you kind of forgot a very important detail there. You want to tell us that story?
Yeah, well, yes, sir. I have to tell you. I didn't fall down out of heaven. I came up out of hell like everybody else.
Right.
And so one of the things, I used to smoke marijuana.
Okay.
As a young person. And so, I used to do it, okay. My wife and I and my young son at that time were going to go visit one of her relatives. And so I would remember changing the tire on the car. And during the process of changing that tire, as anybody who would know, one thing the marijuana does is it kind of dulls your senses, and it kind of makes your mind wander. And so I thought that I had tightened those bolts on the tire that I had just changed. Certainly, you wouldn't get on the expressway knowing that you hadn't tightened the bolts.
Right.
But we did. And I would venture to say we had traveled pretty close to 60 miles or 70 miles on the expressway, because we were leaving Milwaukee and we were going to Danville, Illinois. And so, you're on the expressway, you're doing 60, 65 miles an hour. And I noted there was a kind of wobble, but I wasn't thinking anything of it. And finally, somebody came past and was pretty emotional, pointing to us about to pull over, and those boats had just about worked their way completely off of that rim. And I don't have to tell you what would have taken place had those boats completely come off of that rim. We wouldn't have made it, because we were doing 55, 60 miles an hour all that time. So, I had not thought about that much until this conversation.
So
to think back of how many times God has intervened in my life, and that was the second time that God had intervened and spared us.
Oh, that's great. So traveling at 55, 60 miles an hour and losing a tire could have been pretty disastrous on a big highway like that, especially if there's other traffic around.
It was the rear tire.
Wow. I have a friend who had a similar experience with a motorcycle, believe it or not.
Wow.
Yeah, he's a professional mechanic. His name is Joe Pinto. He's from New York. And his story actually is one of the stories in my book, Divine Intervention, 50 True Stories of God's Miracles Today. But anyway, he experienced a pretty big wake-up call that God was real one day. In 2003, he was having trouble with his motorcycle. And he couldn't drive it, so he decided to ride his son's bike for a while his was out of commission. So his son's bike, the front rim, or the front axle, had a bad axle nut. It was stripped. So he took the nut off of his bike and put it on his son's, and he was riding that bike around until he got his bike fixed. So he finally got his bike fixed, and he basically, he was going to go on vacation that weekend, that Sunday, but Saturday he was going to a fishing expedition with his daughter. So he put his daughter on the back of the bike. He got on the bike, and they rode about 45 miles to this fishing boat, and they were late too. He was going like 90 miles an hour on the Long Island Expressway. And then on the way back, he was doing another 55 miles an hour, nice leisurely ride. So he gets home, and then the following morning he's going to leave for Pennsylvania for vacation. He drives about a mile down to the gas station, puts gas in the bike, and then when he comes out of the gas station, the bike starts fishtailing and shaking. And he's like, whoa, what's going on? And so he pulls over and he looks, and there was no nut holding the front axle in place. He had forgotten to replace the axle nut from his son's bike. And so, he said that the axle had worked its way out several inches and, was almost basically coming off, but he gingerly drove it back to his house about a mile away, and he put the nut on, made the adjustment, tightened it up, and then he was able to go to Pennsylvania. But, he's a professional mechanic, and he's been working on bikes, boats, and cars for like over 20 years. And he said that was a big wake-up call to know that God was there and holding that axle in place, because you got no nut on the front. There's nothing holding it on. He said he drove about over 100 miles at highway speeds, and the wheel was still on. I mean, if that wheel had seized up or come off, both he and his daughter could have been killed or seriously injured. So God got his attention with that, and he's now like really active in the church and serving the Lord, but he looks back on that as clear evidence, and he said that Sunday morning, God was like, all right, I'm letting go of this axle. Now it's time to remember that you left the nut off there. So very interesting stuff. And, I believe that, God sends angels and he protects us and he keeps us, safe. And sometimes we may not even realize it until later on that he's working in our lives. So, interesting stuff. Friend, if you're just tuning in, we are speaking with our special guest, Earl Ingram. And he's going to be sharing some more of his life journey and some of the amazing things that God has done in his life, including the horrific car accident that nearly took his life and his family's life, and how that was a turning point that led Earl to really commit himself to serving the Lord. Stay with us on Divine Intervention Radio.
You're listening to Divine Intervention with Daniel Fazina, and we'll return in just a moment.
I believe in miracles.
Hey, this is Daniel Fazina of Divine Intervention Radio. The Bible contains some incredible stories of miracles and divine interventions. Jesus calmed a raging storm, healed paralytics, and even raised the dead. But are these types of events still happening today? The answer to this question, as you will see from reading my book, Divine Intervention, 50 True Stories of God's Miracles Today, is an emphatic yes. Contained within the book is a collection of amazing true stories that attest to this fact. You will read the astonishing first-hand accounts of people who have been healed of paralysis, terminal cancer, and tumors through prayer. You will see the love of God powerfully transform the life of an Islamic terrorist. You will witness the liberation of the demon-possessed, the resurrection of the dead, and much more. Prepare to be awed and inspired as you experience divine intervention. More information about Divine Intervention, 50 True Stories of God's Miracles Today can be found at www.divineinterventionradio.com or by calling 800-247-4784. That's 1-800-247-4784. Times are tough, not getting easier, but there's an opportunity that could make a significant change in your financial situation. People are paying too much for home utilities, and everybody has them. Help friends and family save money and get paid for it. No obligation. You don't even have to talk to anyone unless you want to. Just listen to a 3-minute recorded message. Call now, 203-717-3124. 203-717-3124. Listen, decide, and you could be on your way to a better tomorrow. 203-717-3124. Divine Intervention welcomes the support of Latirzo Associates, Certified Public Accountants. Latirzo Associates, Certified Public Accountants is a family-owned and operated Christian business serving their clients with quality accounting services for over 40 years, offering full-service accounting for any type of business, large or small, in any state of the union. Latirzo Associates, Certified Public Accountants, 12 Oak Street, No. 5, West Hampton Beach, New York, 11978. Phone 631-288-3334. That's 631-288-3334. Noticed your utility bills getting bigger lately? The cost of electric and natural gas is soaring, but there is good news. Thanks to energy deregulation, you now have a choice who to purchase your energy from. Upgrade your service to Ambit Energy and save money every month. There's no cost to switch, and nothing changes about your service except the amount you pay. Earn travel rewards and even free energy through Ambit's innovative referral program. Switch to Ambit Energy and start saving today. www.flexpower.joinambit.com. That's flexpower.joinambit.com.
This is Joan Hunter. You are now listening to Divine Intervention with Daniel Fazina.
When I'm feeling all alone, there's so far to go. The signs are nowhere on this road, guiding me home. When the night is closing in, it's falling on my skin. Oh God, will you come close? You light up the sky. You light up the sky to show me you are with me. And I can't deny, no I can't deny that you are right here with me. You've opened my eyes so I can see you all around me. You light up the sky. You light up the sky to show me that you are with me.
Welcome back to Divine Intervention Radio. I'm your host, Daniel Fazina, and if you're just tuning in, we are visiting with our special guest, Earl Ingram Jr., who is a friend of mine that I used to book guests for when I was a publicist and he was a radio show host, and he hails out of Wisconsin. So welcome back, Earl.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I really appreciate this opportunity.
No problem. So before the break, we talked about a couple of incidences of divine intervention that had to do with cars. It seems like much of your life revolved around cars and the auto industry, and this next one we'd like to talk about also involves how God protected you in a very serious auto accident, and you kind of look back and you can see how God was speaking to you and kind of protecting you through it. So why don't you tell us that story? That was a pretty amazing one.
Well, this one was and is a measuring stick on what I think is probably the most important turning point in my life, and that has to have been about 17 years ago now.
Okay.
My wife got a call from her father's relatives in Mississippi. We are city folks and city dwellers, and for the most part have not spent any time in the South. And Tylertown, Mississippi is a one stoplight town, like Mayberry and the old Andy Griffith show. And so never will forget, we got a call that Wednesday. I got home from work and my wife told me that her father was deathly ill. He had cancer. So we were told that he was not going to make it, and so they wanted my wife to come down. He said that he wanted to see her and his grandchildren, which was my sons, because he knew death was imminent.
Right.
And so we hopped in a car and took off down to Tylertown, Mississippi. A heck of a long drive.
Yeah, from Wisconsin? That's like, how many hours is that?
That had to be about 10 hours or more, because we had to go completely through the state of Mississippi, which is a very long state. Tylertown was towards Biloxi and Gulfport.
Right. Okay.
And so I never will forget, all the time we were driving, I would always notice these flatbeds on the expressway.
Mm-hmm.
And those flatbeds always had wrecks on them, cars that looked pretty well beaten up. And all I could imagine and think about as we drove past those was, wow, I wonder if people made it through that.
Mm-hmm.
And little did I know that that would be our future. So anyway, to make a long story short, we made it down to Mississippi, and my wife's father, God allowed him to live long enough for us to get there. And so he passed, not a whole lot later than the time we got there. I would venture to say within an hour and a half, 2 hours from the time we got there.
Wow,
so,
that's amazing.
So God allowed him to stay alive long enough to see his grandchildren, who we hadn't seen in many years. My youngest son he had never seen. And
Praise
his
God.
daughter, my wife, who he hadn't seen in a number of years. So after that, we're down in Tylertown, Mississippi. It's in the Delta, so it's a very poor area of the South. And as we were in broad daylight in the home, you could see these huge roaches.
Oh, boy.
The big ones, I mean, and mice running around in broad daylight.
Wow.
In the home, because the homes weren't very secure.
Right.
And so they said, well, you guys can stay here until the funeral. and my wife and my sons they weren't going for that. So we said, okay, what we'll do is we'll drive down to Biloxi, which was 125 miles from Tylertown. Biloxi is a beautiful resort at the Gulf of Mississippi. And so I never will forget we did that. We went and stayed down there and for a couple of days and kind of enjoyed things, not thinking about, what had just occurred. So, make a long story short, we then decided we're going to head back that Saturday was the time that the funeral was going to happen. So I never will forget, my wife and I, we had been up kind of late that Saturday morning. It was only, to me, I figure it's only 125 miles. Chicago is about 90 miles from Milwaukee, and during the broad daylight, we've made that trek many times. So I figured, no problem, I'll be able to do it. But for a split second, I kind of nodded behind the wheel, and I just bought a brand new Riviera, and on Highway 49 in Mississippi, it is the most beautiful road you'd ever see, because I later found out that they do a lot of logging out of there. Mississippi has a lot of timber.
Okay.
And so those trucks move in and out of there, and commerce is very big there in trees. And so the roads are absolutely gorgeous, and this is during the summer, so those trees covered up. It was like a canopy. The sun was shining, just an absolutely gorgeous and scenic view. So my wife told me, after she saw me nod, I had the car up to about 95 miles an hour, and she said, let me drive. And I said no. I was pretty stubborn, and that testosterone thing kicked in, and I don't feel comfortable with anybody else driving but myself. And not more than what appeared to be a few seconds later, I nodded again. And I know I had come down from that 90-something to about 75, which was the speed limit at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I was about to go into what looked like a ravine.
Oh, my gosh.
And so my wife pushed me, and I snapped to very quickly and saw myself in the car about to go into the ravine. So I slammed on the brakes and steered hard to the right. Down in that area, they have loose gravel on the shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
And I hit that loose gravel. I slammed on my brakes, and the anti-locking brakes, never will forget, kicked in. And I remember the rear end of the car fishtailing. And as I slammed on the brakes, the car went airborne.
Oh, boy.
Now, let me tell you about how good God is. We remember after the car went airborne and we turned over 5 times, we came all the way across the highway.
Oh, my gosh.
And there was a car on the side of the road. It was off the road itself, but it was parked on the side of the road. We had went airborne and turned over 5 times, did a roll, and our car came to a stop upside down up against this car that was placed on the shoulder of the road. Well, just that morning, we had a conversation with a nice family that was in the same hotel we were in, and we both wished each other luck in their journey back home. And do you know, after our car had spun and turned over, and my wife and I came to, I had at the time a 17-year-old son and a 10-year-old son. None of us had on seatbelts.
None of you?
And
oh my gosh.
None of us had on seatbelts. And as we climbed out of the wreckage, my wife and I, we heard our 17-year-old son, his name is Jason, and he was asking and looking for Julius, who at the time was my 10-year-old son. And we kept hearing him ask for Julius. Where's Julius? Where's Julius? And so my wife and I got up and we started looking. Where's Julius? Where's Julius? In the meantime, that very family that we had wished God's blessings to at the hotel was the family that pulled up and saw us and said, oh my God.
What?
Said, do you realize you turned over 5 times? We saw you go airborne. They were behind us.
Oh my gosh.
And so they get out of the car, and other Good Samaritans start pulling up, and they all asked, is everybody accounted for? I hesitantly said no, and my wife said, no, my son is missing. My son is missing. And so everybody's looking around. They can't find him. And now the realization finally hits. He must be underneath the wreckage of our car.
Oh my
There's
gosh.
nowhere else he could be. And so as my wife cried out for what seemed like the 100th time, we heard a faint cry, response. Julius, 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 and we heard this response. And so everybody said, quiet, quiet. She hollered again, and we heard him moan. And as we looked around, nobody knew where it could be. But guess where he was?
I want to guess, but do tell us. I'm on the edge of my seat here.
He was underneath the rear end of the car that our car stopped rolling, the one that was on the shoulder of the road. He was face up underneath the rear of that car.
Oh, my
and
gosh.
I never will forget, the highway patrolman came over and he said, do you guys know how lucky you were? Now, because by that time we had, and the Good Samaritans tipped that car up on its shoulder, my wife got up and dragged our son from underneath the rear end of that car that stopped our road. And so he had a huge softball-sized knot on his head. He had a pretty bad burn on his knee and a burn on his wrist. But the state patrolman said, boy, are you guys lucky. And I said, well, luck had nothing to do with that. I said, only God spared us.
Wow.
Now, as they're rushing us to the hospital and ambulances, I had no damage to me. I wasn't hurt at all. Nor was my oldest son. And at the time, I thought my wife wasn't either. So while we're in the hospital, in the emergency room, the doctor comes out and he says, I got some good news and some bad news. Which one do you want to hear first?
Oh,
now,
boy.
I'm devastated already because this is because of my shortcomings and thinking that I had to be Superman. And even though I was tired,
right,
I wasn't going to trust anyone else behind the wheel but myself. And so all that guilt was rushing through me when he asked me that question. And I was devastated, and I said, well, give me the bad news first. And I'm waiting to hear about my son. And he said, your wife has a broken back.
Oh, my gosh.
And now I'm devastated because I saw her get up and drag my son by his arms out underneath the vehicle when we had kind of tilted it up on the side.
She must have been running on
I'm
adrenaline.
really devastated. He waited a few seconds. He saw how devastated I was. And he said, but now do you want to hear the good news? And I said, well, I don't see how there can be any good news. My wife's back is broken. He said, well, normally a bone, I've never seen anything like this. The bone generally breaks in a jagged fashion. He said, but your wife's break was clean. I've never seen it. He said, you know why that's important? I said, no, why? He said, because had it broken the way bones normally break, it would have pierced her spine and she would have been a quadriplegic.
Oh, my gosh.
And at that time in the hospital, I never will forget, I made a commitment to God that I would do his work. It does not matter. I'll never get tired. I'll never argue against anything that he asks me to do. I'll be his servant until he takes me away from here. That was 17 years ago.
Wow.
And so when I got back to Milwaukee, what God had in store for me, I never would have thought, but it was at that point in time that I became the president of one of the best and greatest organizations here in the city. It is a nonprofit organization. I've been the president, executive director now for the past 17 years. It is all volunteer. It is a youth football program where we have over 800 boys, 30 football teams. We have young men in universities all over this country, 3 who are playing professional, in an all-volunteer youth program.
Wow.
For poor Central City kids that we are changing their lives forever.
That is
That's
awesome.
what God has wanted me to do. That's where he placed me, and I've been there now for 17 years. This is my 18th year at the helm of the Neighborhood Children's Sports League.
That is amazing.
The acronym is NCSL.
Wow.
and I've learned so much about just listening to what God wants you to do.
Right.
And nothing to question. I often told people that people say, well, how can you keep doing all this? You're giving 5 months of your life a year in a volunteer basis to work with these kids ages 6 through 14, and you don't get paid. I said, well, you fail to understand the debt that I owe. Not only did God spare my life, my family's life, but as we came across that highway, all it would have taken was a car to hit us. And not only would my family had been gone, but so would the family that was coming up behind us.
That's
so
incredible.
Not only did he spare our lives and my life, he didn't allow me to have to live for the remainder of my life with knowing I had taken somebody else's life through my carelessness. So I owe a debt that I will never be able to repay.
Wow, that is amazing, Earl. I'm so happy that he spared your life. Again, friend, you're listening to Divine Intervention Radio. I'm your host, Daniel Fazina, and we are visiting with our special guest, Earl Ingram Jr. His website is www.earlingramjr.com. That's earlingramjr.com. Now, Earl, how was your wife? I mean, she obviously recovered okay after that, or?
She recovered. At the time, these little towns did not have airports, so they had to transport her in the gurney to the airport, and we had to have a special plane to fly her here to Milwaukee.
And your sons are?
But she has completely recovered. My entire family has recovered, and I really realized just how important it is to make a commitment to God and in your life, and really a serious commitment. And because there's so many people who say they believe and that they are going to dedicate themselves and the rest of their time to doing the work of the Lord, but I know fully how critically important that is, and whatever time I have left is going to continue to be spent with serving He who has given so much for all of us.
Amen. That is awesome. And just to think about, none of you were wearing seatbelts, and your car flipped.
Out of one.
5 times in the air?
5 times.
My gosh, it's amazing.
The only reason I knew it was 5 times is because I'm telling you about the family,
right?
That pulled up, and the fact that God would not only place the car on the shoulder of the road, because had He not placed that car there, we would have slammed into a tree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it kept rolling,
and the tree certainly would have finished us, because the trees don't give.
Right.
The car we hit was like a cushioning.
Wow.
Blow. and so that's
amazing.
That's the end of that story.
Wow. I'm just blown away. That's amazing. My sister had a similar experience when she was a teenager. She's an older sister of mine, but I remember back in the 80s when she was driving this old, I think it was a Duster or a Nova. And,
Duster. Wow, that's pretty far back there.
Oh, yeah. But she was not wearing a seatbelt either, and someone fell asleep at the wheel and came across the lane, and she had a head-on, and she was thrown out of the car. And, when the police and everybody, the EMTs got there, they said, normally you have a much better chance of surviving if you have your seatbelt on, because you won't be thrown from the car. But when you're thrown from the car, you have a higher chance of death. But in this case, they said it was actually good that she wasn't wearing the seatbelt, because that car was so totally demolished and smashed. She was thrown out the window and somehow landed on the side of the road in the grass. And the amazing thing was, it happened to be right in front of the entrance to the emergency room of the hospital. So they were at the front door of the hospital when this accident occurred. And she was able to, be rushed in and saved. But that car was so wrecked, they were surprised anyone survived it. They said if she was stuck in the car, she would have been dead.
Daniel, I think everybody has a story.
Yeah.
If they really thought about it long enough, where God has certainly, if not themselves, some loved one,
right,
has shown His goodness and His greatness. And so I don't think it's anything special. I just know that if we live long enough, He'll reveal Himself to all of us
You know, I appreciate the fact that you recognize God's hand in your life, because some people can go through those situations and chalk it up to luck or coincidence or happenstance. But you didn't. You know, you really understood that it was God protecting you and your family in that situation, and you took a step and you committed your life to the Lord, and you're doing His work. And, you know, part of that work, among mentoring other kids, you took in a special needs child of your own, Jamari. You want to tell us about that and how, you know, taking in this special needs child has affected your life?
Well, you know, Daniel, it is probably the most significant thing that has ever happened to my wife and I. And 11 years ago, my wife's great nephew was 2 years old, and my wife's niece was a young girl who had a child out of wedlock and had this child long before she was ready to take care of the child. And I remember having seen this precious little baby, and he was just such a ball of energy. And I just grew accustomed to seeing him and loving him. And then we got the call saying that this little baby had a broken arm. And so at the time, we thought nothing of it. But then as we started looking into it, my wife's great nephew, who was Jamari, we saw a terrible burn on his foot. And so my wife's niece was living with a guy who was not the baby's father, and she was leaving this child with him. And I know the annals are full of young ladies who leave their babies to be set by somebody that's not the father of the child. And so I remember, after having seen all of that damage that was done to this child, my wife and I, at that point in time, I remember challenging the young man who had been watching this child and telling him that I don't have any criminal record, but there's just some things that are worth going to jail for, and that if he ever put his hands on that child again, I had never been to jail. I have zip in the way of a criminal record, but I was about to have one if that's what it took.
Oh my gosh!
To make sure that that child was safe.
Right.
So to make a long story short, we wound up keeping that child for 4 years because the young lady could not handle him or deal with him. Well, as time went on, we noticed there was something that was not right with this child. And what it really came down to, what wasn't right with him, is that he couldn't talk, he couldn't speak, and he vibrated a lot. So as the years went on, we were able to take him to neurologists and find out what was going on. We later found out at the age of 5 that he had epilepsy.
Okay.
And worse than that, he had an illness called pica. Pica is an insidious illness that doesn't go away, and that adults even have, where they put things in their mouth: glass, rubber, plastic, staples, things that, if ingested, could eventually pierce their intestine and then cause death.
Right.
So Jamari has those issues, and so we have been dealing with him. He also has some severe behavioral problems. But now it's been 11 years. They said he'd never talk, he'd never walk. He's doing all of that and then some. So God has spared this child. God has given us the temperament to keep fighting for his survival. And now God has shown that even with a child as disabled as Jamari, if you look at him, you could not tell that he has any of those things. He is the most beautifully loving child that you ever want to see. But he has these serious maladies. So it's another time that I think God has put this before my wife and I.
Okay.
To see if we are what we say we are, if we believe in him, if we're truly ready to serve him. Well, I think when God puts things before you, it's easy to say, well, it's too tough for me.
Right.
But we have chosen to do what God has asked us to do, and that's to spend the rest of our lives committed and dedicated to Mr. Jamari Harris. We and my wife are 60 years old now, and Jamari is 13, so for the remainder of our lives, we'll never be empty nesters. we'll be committed to this young man for the remainder of our lives.
That's a beautiful thing. And what do you think God is teaching you through looking after Jamari?
Patience. Patience. Because I thought I was a patient person before. But when you are dealing with this young man, he breaks things. If he doesn't get his way, he's functioning on a 5-year-old level. So he can get very frustrated as he's gotten older. I think he's starting to realize that there's something different about him.
Okay.
But we've learned to be more patient and, more than anything else, more loving. And the most important thing is never judge a book by its cover.
Mm-hmm.
Because disabilities that people have, you look at them and you think that everybody is quote-unquote normal. Well, you know what? Jamari can't read, he can't write, and we don't think he'll ever be able to do any of those things. But he is the most loving child you would ever meet and I've ever met in my life.
That is awesome.
So you can't judge a book by its cover.
Right.
And it does not matter how smart you are, how much money you have. It's how much love do you have for your fellow man.
Amen. Amen.
That is the most important message, I would say.
Well, thank you, Earl Ingram, for joining us here on Divine Intervention and sharing your insights and your divine intervention experiences, how God protected you and preserved you and really caused you to take stock of your life and make a commitment to the Lord. I want to thank you so much for the work you're doing, and I want to encourage you to keep up the great work you're doing, mentoring kids, and, of course, taking care of your precious Jamari. So thanks again for joining us, Earl.
Thank you very much, Daniel. We appreciate it.
All right. Well, friend, that about does it for this episode of Divine Intervention Radio. Again, I'm your host, Daniel Fazina, and we'll be back next time with another exciting guest and an awesome testimony. So join us again on Divine Intervention Radio. Take care and God bless.
You've been listening to Divine Intervention with your host, Daniel Fazina. You can email Daniel at divineintervention@mail.com. That's divineintervention@mail.com. All programs of Divine Intervention are available online at divineinterventionradio.com. That's divineinterventionradio.com. Join us next time here on Divine Intervention.
I believe in miracles.
Hey, this is Daniel Fazina of Divine Intervention Radio. The Bible contains some incredible stories of miracles and divine interventions. Jesus calmed a raging storm, healed paralytics, and even raised the dead. But are these types of events still happening today? The answer to this question, as you will see from reading my book, Divine Intervention, 50 True Stories of God's Miracles Today, is an emphatic yes. Contained within the book is a collection of amazing true stories that attest to this fact. You will read the astonishing first-hand accounts of people who have been healed of paralysis, terminal cancer, and tumors through prayer. You will see the love of God powerfully transform the life of an Islamic terrorist. You will witness the liberation of the demon-possessed, the resurrection of the dead, and much more. Prepare to be awed and inspired as you experience divine intervention. More information about Divine Intervention, 50 True Stories of God's Miracles Today can be found at www.divineinterventionradio.com or by calling 800-247-4784. That's 1-800-247-4784. Times are tough, not getting easier, but there's an opportunity that could make a significant change in your financial situation. People are paying too much for home utilities, and everybody has them. Help friends and family save money and get paid for it. No obligation. You don't even have to talk to anyone unless you want to. Just listen to a 3-minute recorded message. Call now, 203-717-3124. 203-717-3124. Listen, decide, and you could be on your way to a better tomorrow. 203-717-3124.